I want to talk to you guys about a very popular religious leader in Renaissance Florence named Girolamo de Savonarola. He preached against the Sodomites. He preached against witchcraft. He preached against the abuse of the poor. He exposed the Pope. He exposed the corrupt religious leaders. He exposed the evils of the Medici controlled government, the Medici family. A lot of people hated him. And he was very popular, especially amongst the average people, because he was preaching against the excessive taxation that was being imposed on the regular people. The most famous of the Medici leaders was Lorenzo de Medici. After he died, his son, Piero de Medici, took over, and he lasted about 2 years because there were mobs that rose up and they revolted against the Medici-controlled government, and Piero de Medici fled. After the Medici dynasty fell apart, Savonarola began to really rule over Florence. And he preached against Sodom. He went against a lot of the sickness that was prevalent in Florence, the spiritual sickness, the lack of really of human decency that was quite present in Florence. He was working to purge Florence of various evils. One of them, of course, was Sodom, which he preached against with great tenacity. He also preached against and he also tried to get rid of the very violent territorial aggression that was common in Florence. So, for example, every year there would be this big party in Florence, and you would have fighting between various neighborhoods, and each neighborhood would set up like a barricade or a barrier to block out the other neighborhoods. And if you were from a different neighborhood and you wanted to get into another neighborhood to party, you first had to go through very aggressive interrogation where they would ask you very, very personal questions, and then you had to pay some kind of fee. So they would extort you if you wanted to get into a different neighborhood. And then you had intense fighting between different neighborhoods in which people would throw rocks at each other, crack skulls, and at times people were actually killed in these scuffles, in these neighborhood fights. Savonarola wanted to get rid of all of this, and he recruited an army of very devout young men. He recruited an army of about 6,000 or 7,000 or so young men who wanted to purge Florence of its evils. And so when these parties were going on and there were different blockades between neighborhoods, these young men would set up their own barricades. And they would say, if you want to enter, if you want to get past this barrier, you have to pay alms to the poor. You have to give charity. And they were working to purge Florence of its evils, of its vices. Savonarola, he preached against, as I said, against Sodom, and he preached against the corruption. He preached against all of these types of evils. And a lot of people hated him. There were various political factions that were extremely anti-Savonarola. For example, you had the Bigi. The Bigi means gray, so they called themselves the Grays. These were people who had nostalgia for Medici rule. They wanted the Medici dynasty to rule over Florence again. And then you had the Bianchi. Bianchi means the whites, and they called themselves the whites in order to distinguish themselves from the gray or the Bigi. The Bianchi wanted the same thing as the Bigi. They wanted a return back to Medici rule. And you also had the Tiepidi. Tiepidi means the tepid ones, the moderates, the lukewarm people. These were political moderates who did not mind working with moderate priests who were also against Savonarola. And then you had the Arrabbiati. Arrabbiati literally means the enraged ones or the angry ones. And these were the most vicious of the political factions against Savonarola, and they became the biggest anti-Savonarola faction. On the pro-Savonarola side, you had mainly two factions. You had the Frateschi, which means the friars' sons. These were monks who were pro-Savonarola, who supported Savonarola. And then you had the Piagnoni. Piagnoni means the Wailers, the ones who cry out for their sins. They cry out for forgiveness of their sins. And the Piagnoni became the biggest pro-Savonarola faction in Florence. And the violence, the political tension in Florence at this time was violent, and there were several instances in which people literally tried to kill Savonarola. So Savonarola always had to walk around with a bodyguard. The Pope at the time, Pope Alexander VI, wanted Savonarola to shut his mouth. There was, in fact, a letter that was being distributed around, supposedly written by the Pope, but it was actually forged by a bishop who hated Savonarola. And this forged letter said that Savonarola was a false prophet, and that he needed to shut his mouth, he needed to be silent. And the bishop who wrote this, who forged this letter, was Bartolomeo Floridi, bishop of Cosenza. And the Vatican had a very pro-Medici faction within it, and it was this pro-Medici faction that wanted Savonarola to shut his mouth. They didn't want to automatically excommunicate Savonarola because the Vatican was afraid of the King of France, Charles VIII, who was very, very pro-Savonarola. In fact, Charles VIII would invade the Vatican and occupy it for quite some time, eventually leaving, but nonetheless, the Pope did not want to get on the bad side of the King of France, so they didn't want to automatically excommunicate Savonarola. They simply told him to shut his mouth. Savonarola, being the man that he was, of course, did not listen, continued to preach, and the Vatican said, "Please be quiet," and he said no. And the Pope Alexander VI, said, "Okay, fine, you can talk," but Pope Alexander VI did not put that permission in writing. It was a verbal permission. The reason for this is because later on in the future, the Pope can simply deny that he ever gave this permission because it wasn't in writing. So it was a very New York lawyer move that the Vatican pulled off. Savonarola was a man who preached against the corruption both in the government of the Medici and also within the Vatican. And they wanted him silenced. Many people wanted him dead. The Arrabbiati were a political faction that were pro-Sodom. They hated what Savonarola had to say. They did not want religion to have any involvement in the state. And we read this history and we think, many of us could think, oh, look, back in the days, everything was Christian and blah, 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 blah. But here they had, in the Renaissance era, 15th century, a political faction that was anti-Christian, that was pro-Sodom, telling us that really nothing has changed all that much. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.